Now it is my pleasure to introduce Rachel Skwersky, who will be giving a talk. She graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, with a degree in cognitive science and minor in data science. And she's currently working in the KID lab in the same university. And today she's presenting a study that she conducted with Jenny Lu. Jenny is a scholar in psychology, public policy, and disability studies. And she's an incoming assistant professor jointly appointed between Disability Studies and Institute for Society and Genetics in the University of California, Los Angeles, starting in summer 2026. And before we start the presentation, Jenny and Rachel will be giving a personal statement. So the floor is yours now. Please, Jenny, Rachel.
We'll go ahead and get started. So I have deaf parents. I'm a CODA. Jenny is my mentor and gave me the opportunity to present today, and I really appreciate being able to do that. I work with a group of deaf researchers and linguists and getting to look at my passion, which is language and linguistics, and I'm grateful to be able to do that. Today we'll be talking about diversity among sign languages and spoken languages. So I'm not deaf myself. I am a white person. I am very aware of my privilege in society. And I'll allow Jenny to now present herself so that you are aware of who we are.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Lu. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really excited to share this work that Rachel and I have been collaborating on for some time. I've been working with her as an undergrad during my time as a postdoc, and Rachel has worked very, very hard and copiously to document her understanding of languages. Sorry, a little technical here. So I'm a deaf person. Have been involved in the deaf community in the US and internationally. I have lived abroad in Europe, Germany, and the UK to be exact. I'm studying and learning German and DGS, German Sign Language, since 2014. I'm also an Asian American person, and so have a lot of connections in that part of the world, have traveled extensively to Japan and China, and I'm interested in the historical culture of the relationship between the US and China and the relationship between China and Japan, as well as other countries. So I'm a historian in that mind as well. I am not linguistic, but I do learn through my different projects. So I'm looking forward to getting your questions and answers during this presentation. Feel free to interrupt at any time. After each slide, if there are any clarification questions, hold the theoretical, conceptual questions for the end for the Q&A, please. But feel free to interrupt. Thank you. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yes, I'll go ahead and start. Let me go ahead and begin by sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Looking at the topic of our talk, which is human lexical semantics are not universal. And we'll look at evidence from Western and Asian sign languages. Give you a minute to look at the slide. So where is this gradation that we have within languages and the concepts being expressed? We're showing it here based on colors and to give the sort of concept of how gradation works. So we have so many different colors, but we've limited the labeling of these colors to certain categories like green, blue, pink, purple. And this has to do with how they are perceived. So sign languages demonstrate both semantic gradients and discreteness visually, and they do that through using the classifier system. This allows us to describe things. For example, a vase. We can look at the shape of the vase, and there's certain rules about which hand shapes can be used to describe a vase, like the one that I've just done for you. So that's a discrete display. And for the gradient, we can use very specific movements and location and modify the phonology to show more specifics in the particular shape. So here's some examples of that. So through pointing and deixis, those things allow us to categorize established roles, perhaps based on location, agent, patient, for example, and it also allows you to describe things in a gradient way. So there's an infinite amount of places in space that we can use to establish these ideas. And here we have pronominal usage, which can mean she, he, or they. In an abstract way, we're able to describe that gradient of meaning. So then what does colexification tell us about language development, emergence, grammaticalization, and cognition? We have perceptual categories that we use in language, and they can then extend to other meanings that are related conceptually. So in spoken English, we see this happening. For this particular example, the word for glass, the concept for glass, whether it's a cup or a window, you can use the same English word to describe both of these concepts. And here we have the frozen form labeling of these objects, the word for glass, glass. Again, I'll just give you a moment. So cross-linguistic patterns in spoken language suggest that there are deep universal concepts and conceptual associations that structure our lexicon. And you can see on this slide how things come out from the central node, which is a way to describe how the brain relates to the various concepts in these web-like structures. So we have these conventions which are constrained by concepts model, and showing how all these various concepts have links to one another. And all of this is sort of what exists in your mind as the lexicon. Colexification provides us with evidence for a general principle of cognitive economy, and also relationships which require less cognitive effort, be it for communication or the ability to learn new concepts. So in the larger sort of oval shape, you see the word chicken related to other concepts. For example, chicken, the meat, the food, the animal itself, or being timid. All those concepts in English are related and can be expressed by that one word, chicken. Colexification does demonstrate both synchronic and diachronic properties. Synchronic, for example, if you have a riverbank and a financial institution In English, they share the same word, bank. So these are considered synchronic examples of colexification. And now I'll give you an example of a diachronic colexification example. And this is something where the semantic shift occurs over a period of time. So we started off in English with the word mouse to represent the animal. However, over time, we've added an additional meaning, which is the tool that you use with a computer. So the cursor that you need to move around on your screen is controlled by a mouse. So we use the same word to describe this concept. So it is colexification, but diachronic colexification. So far we've talked about how this works in spoken languages, but now let's talk about how this functions amongst sign languages. So the work that we have looked at for our own work is by Srinivasan and Regularities. They'll be referenced quite a bit in our presentation today. Let's look at how languages support these. We looked at 3 different hypotheses: the conceptual constraint hypothesis, the cognitive diversity hypothesis, and the modality constraint hypothesis. And this all supports how spoken language supports this colexification. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into the first hypothesis, which is the conceptual constraint one. We look at universal structures, and we looked at a comparison between spoken and sign languages, and you can look at the webs on here. So we did a web analysis looking at related words and related concepts. So if this hypothesis was effective in looking at sign languages, we should be able to see that extensions follow the same principles that we saw in the spoken languages. So you would think that sign languages and spoken languages would share the same process. And the different types of colexification would appear from those lexicons, and you would see that appearing within spoken languages and sign languages. That's what you would expect to see if this hypothesis works for sign languages. The second hypothesis, I'll just give you a moment to look at this slide as well. So this one is the cognitive diversity hypothesis, where you have different kinds of colexification patterns that come from the embodied experiences of signers, because they are reliant on visual modality to get through life, to get through the world. And there's 2 main branches of this sort of embodied visual experience, which happens pre-linguistically, and where the influence comes from that on visual spatial affordances to do with sign languages, and how that maps on those pre-linguistic concepts map onto signs in sign language. So this is the iconic mapping. And so we have mentally these various conceptual categories, and I'll give you some examples of this. If we think about a pencil and a toothbrush, they share the same basic form. And what I mean by that is the visual modality of these categories belong to the same grouping because of their visual form and properties. Here's an example of a pencil and a toothbrush here on the slide. So for the linguistic concept and showing the form and shape of the object, share the same feature. So you see that this is evidence of this diversity theory. This is the third hypothesis that we looked at, the modality constraint hypothesis, and I'll give you a moment just to look over this slide. So sign languages are manual visual in modality, and they shape polysemy in a different way. So we see double mapping constraint having an impact here. In the real world context, we have 3 different types of mapping. And in sign language, you have articulators, which are our hands, our source domain, which is iconic, the literal form of an object. And then we have the target domain, or the metaphor. So we're going from target to target, and then we have iconic mapping onto the metaphor. And I'll give you some real world examples of this. I know it's a complicated concept, but I will be able to make it more explicit. So in spoken languages, it's possible to say, the acid ate the key, right? That's an acceptable sentence in English. But in sign language, that doesn't work. You can't borrow the sign for the concept eating something because the location on the mouth doesn't map onto the iconic metaphor of a key. So you have an inanimate object. You can't use a physical eating of that, right? It's not, a key isn't edible. It's not something that you would put into your mouth. So you can't mix these signs and expect to see polysemy. You have to use a different way of expressing that concept. Perhaps you would say something like the acid, you'd fingerspell the acid and then show it destroying the key in a visual format that might map onto how it happens in real life. So you have to have the iconic feature and then metaphor match one another. If they don't, then you don't have polysemy. So in effect, polysemy is disallowed, it is blocked, because you can't extend the concept of eating in sign language to acid and a key. I'll give you a moment to read the slide and then I will expand on it. So we did a cross-linguistic study that was surveyed on polysemy by Srinivasan and Ragliati, and we adapted it for sign language participants. We tested 25 categories of polysemy patterns that we had seen in English or identified in English. We used 4 American Sign Language participants, 2 from Germany using DGS, and then we had 2 Japanese Sign Language users as participants. And then we compared the sign language production to the spoken language production that was previously used in the original study back in 2015. They used 14 spoken languages from Asia, the Middle East, and Western European countries. We also collected spoken language data from 2 German speakers. So we did a 3-part analysis. First, we wanted to describe the semantic categories. We wanted to look at the semantic categories and test them for colexification, whether or not it was present. Now you can look at this, and then I'll talk about the one that's highlighted for us. Okay, so now we'll talk about the row which is highlighted. So animal for meat is the pattern, and we abbreviate that as Annie, me. So participating senses of this can be chicken, lamb, fish, shrimp, salmon, etc. And then next to it, you see the sentence. And examples of colexification. So the first sentence is, and I'm going to use signed English to express this, the chicken drank some water. The next to that, the next sentence is, the chicken is tasty. So we have a lot more categories and examples listed here. Just giving you a moment to appreciate all the examples that were used. And again, I can expand a bit on the one that's highlighted. So the pattern here is location and place at location. So we abbreviate that as LOC in, L-O-C in. In this category, we have things like bench, land, floor, ground, box, bottle, jail. And the examples given here is the ground was frozen. And then next to it, the plane was grounded. And this is the last example I'll give. Well, these are the last categories, and then I'll give one more example. So this is visual metaphor for the pattern category. VisFun is the abbreviated form. Examples of this are a beam, a belt, a column, stick, bug, and leaf. And the example sentences, the first one is, most of the weight rests on the beam. And then next to it is, there was a beam of light. So we then did a survey looking at these various categories. We had a couple different contexts. So this is context one, and it says, in English, a chicken is a type of bird. Oh, this is the example. So you can talk about, in English, chicken is a type of bird, and one that typically lives on a farm. And then we would, so we'd go over the example, and then we'd say to the German person, what's your sign for chicken? And we'd ask them to sign it to the experimenter. So that was the first context. And then the second context in our survey is we would ask them about this other example. So we would say, in English, it's possible to use the word chicken to refer to various properties related to chicken. For example, a person could be chicken, right? A person who is timid or gets scared easily. So you could say, he is a chicken. What you're really meaning to say, the implicit meaning, is this person scares easily as a chicken would. So in DGS, we asked if you could say the person was a chicken. So we wanted to see on a scale from yes, absolutely, this doesn't exist, to yes, it absolutely does exist, and that's fine and acceptable in DGS. And so we asked them to rate it on this gradient scale. And if they said that it wasn't a natural sentential format, in DGS, we asked them to tell us that concept in DGS in a way that was comfortable for them. And we did this on Zoom. So the second part of our study had us looking at descriptions of behaviors in sign language and linguistic expression. And we described these strategies individually. The first strategy that we saw being used, we refer to as lexical sign 1.
And I'll ask you just to read the description. So the participants' way of responding used chicken, the same sign, for both contexts, context 1 and context 2. And this is an example of polysemy. The second strategy that we identified or looked at was compound production. So again, the strategy is called compound production, where we look at the first context where they talk about chicken, and the second context, the sign they used for chicken, plus the idea they added onto it. And so because they needed to add another sign to describe it, it was no longer an example of polysemy. Now, some of respondents used finger spelling. So they borrowed from whatever the spoken written language was, whether it be German, English, or Japanese. So for example, chicken in the first context, and then in the second context, perhaps the word chicken was finger spelled. Another example of non-polysemous colexification. Now, some signers just were not clear on how to talk about the idea of chicken or whatever it was in the second context. And that's the response that they wrote, NA. It was not clear for them on how to provide that construction. So another example of where we're not seeing polysemy. And then the final one is lexical sign 2 stroke classifier. Again, the name of the strategy is lexical sign 2 stroke classifier. So here they're signing chicken in the first context, and in the second context, they use a classifier to describe that sentence. So chicken, and then perhaps what it looks like to be afraid, incorporating facial expressions, embodiment of that fear. Again, not an example of polysemy.
Interesting.
Here we see a very busy slide showing all the different categories and the gradients between polysemy to non-polysemy. For production strategies, so right now I'm going to give you, talk about 3 specific examples from this slide. In the circled spaces, those are the examples that I will talk about.
Next strategy.
In the first category, we describe, it's ins kind is the category. And the example was at least tennis in English. And in the second context, it was tennis fun now. Tennis is now fun. Oh, and there seems to be a comment in the chat. Tennis was invented. The second sentence in the same category with the same example is tennis is fun now, or tennis was fun now. So this grouping had a high degree of polysemy, as you can see marked here by the blue. And in the second category, it's INS-ACT is the acronym being used, which is instrumental for action. So instrument for action is the name of that category. An example sentence from this category was hammer. I'm going to use English way of signing. So she hammered the nail onto the wall or in the wall. So for this category, we see a mix of strategies being used. We do see the same, sometimes we saw the same sign being used in both these contexts. Sometimes we saw different signs being used in the second context. Sometimes it was a classifier, sometimes it was a completely different sign. So we saw a mixture, a wide variety of strategies being used. And in the final category, it's labeled vis fun. And what that means is visual metaphor. And you saw a very small degree of polysemy in this category. So you see the high degree of red, which denotes that it's a low proportion of polysemy. We talked about, this was the example using a beam. So having weight on a beam or beam supporting weight. And then there was a beam of light is the second context in which it was which was presented. So we also saw a lot of different strategies being used. And I'll give you just an example of one of the contexts. So here he's using the same sign for turkey, the animal, and turkey, the meat that one might eat. And this is from German Sign Language, so from DGS. And here we have a context that's not fixed, or that's not attested. And it's the concept for belt. So you can see that two different signs were used for the two different contexts presented here. Both of them were classifiers, but they were describing the specific contexts, which are obviously not the same. And here, the person is describing an actual eye, like the eye on your face, the eyes you use to see, and then an eye of a typhoon, and she signs it this way. Oh. Again, this is not polysemy that we're seeing here, because it's two completely different signs being used. And then the third thing that we did was we did a large-scale typological comparison between the spoken languages and the sign languages. So on this chart, we're going to focus on one particular portion and looking at the three different sign languages in our study. And we compare each of them to their respective spoken language. If you see 0, that means there is no polysemy identified for that category. So if we look specifically at Japanese Sign Language, and then, so German Sign Language, Japanese Sign Language, and at the bottom here we have American Sign Language being compared to English. So we see that sign languages and spoken languages pattern very differently when it comes to polysemy. There's a lot more variation in the patterning for DGS, and you see less of that in Japanese Sign Language. Now, for American and English, you see a lot more shared categories of polysemy than you do in the other two sign languages. So Japanese Sign Language with Japanese, German Sign Language and German don't actually share a lot of categories when it comes to polysemy and colexification. So here, I'm showing you 4 different categories where we see polysemy existing in spoken language, but not in sign languages. So then why is that happening? Why do we see less examples of polysemy in sign languages, especially in those categories? I'll let you look at this first before I expand on it. So there's some concepts that are just unrelated when it comes to the source and the text. So if there is some sort of iconic conflict, then you see people using different strategies amongst those 3 sign languages to express those concepts. And similar strategies were actually used across those 3 sign languages. Having said that, iconicity isn't always the only reason that these things are taking place. So it's not always the fault of iconicity. So for example, in Japanese Sign Language, this is a sign used for a peach, the fruit, peach. The Japanese word for that is momo. But in Japanese Sign Language, that sign is used for both the fruit as well as the color. Now, why is that? So here I'll talk about the exceptions in the data set. There are polysemous categories, but if the iconic and metaphor have to match in order for that to be true. So if the object for color, there's animal and meat, which features frequency. There's figure for ground, and then body part for object part. These are the exceptions that we were able to see in the data set. And this is where we start to see semantic bleaching. So you may see a sign like shoulder, which can get used in a couple different contexts. So John's shoulder was tired, and then the car pulled over to the shoulder. Oh, Jenny? Oh, is there a clarification question that I can answer?
I just wondered if the interpreter had missed one of the key points here, which is that we have an exception to the pattern, right? So if I have 2 different meanings, right, or senses of the word, I have an iconic representation of both, and those iconic representations are competing. So what we predict there is that there's no colexification, but there is kind of permission for colexification, even though there is a conflict between the metaphor and the more and the iconic meaning, right? So shoulder is an example of one of these exceptions. It's accepted obviously for the body part, right? So the man's shoulder hurt because it was tired, and then I had to pull off on the shoulder of the road while driving. So that's an extension. So we were looking at why these were allowed, right? And so this is some kind of like, semantic exception in our data. So it's related to probably frequency of use. The concept was probably a bit more weak in terms of its own iconicity. The weakness of iconicity doesn't really explain the entire effect that we see in our data. So we wanted to just make sure, in case it wasn't explained clearly enough through all the interpretation that we have going on here. Thank you.
So what are the implications then for the theory of conceptual structure? Linguistic representations can reshape signers' natural conceptual associations, or they can apply how signers' concepts may differ to begin with. So if we look at the two sections on the left, we see the model for cognitive diversity, and then below that, the model for modality constraint. So the first one is for cognitive diversity, and it shows the two very different concepts, whether it's a ceiling beam and a light beam, and they sort of exist in different places cognitively. And then for the second model that we used was the modality constraint. And this is where these two concepts are connected, but the production of them is then constrained by modality, by the iconic properties, that come from those two very different meanings, whether it's a beam of light or a ceiling beam, for example. So future studies are going to be needed for us to test the cognitive diversity hypothesis, as well as the modality constraint hypothesis, because they are quite different. We're looking for semantic relationships without linguistic expression. And that will allow us to really understand where semantic categories take place in the brain when different items are related or not related, where they exist. It'll be very interesting to know this. So obviously doing this kind of study has implications for understanding mechanisms of language, development, variation, and change over time. If we look specifically at the grammaticalization of pointing, over time and diachronically, we have it going from a demonstrative use, so pointing at the thing over there, the item over there, and over time it has multiple functions. So now, again, pointing has multiple functions that still are demonstrative as before, but now it can also be locative, it can be pronominal, and it can also function as an agreement marker. And we're suggesting that it's also evidence of polysemy. The grammaticalization of the signs for self have also changed from it being self-deictic and demonstrative, and diachronically it's added more functions. It can function as a copula, a self-copula. And today, so as a self-copula, it offers reflexive, emphatic, or as an intensifier, and then also as a nominal marker. But that didn't exist initially, right? It was self-deictic, so demonstrative only, and over time it adds these other functions. And we also are going to suggest that today we see examples of polysemy from this as well. So grammaticalization can happen to various categories, but not necessarily the same categories that we see in spoken language. So that grammaticalization may depend on these gradations of categories between meaning and the related meanings, the categorical meanings of these concepts. So here is our thank you slide to our tremendous collaborators. I think I may have taken a little bit long for my presentation. Apologies for that, but we do now have time for question and answers about...
It was a really fascinating talk. Thank you very much. My name is Svetlana Dachkovsky, and I really wanted to ask a few questions because I was fascinated by the talk. So first of all, one question about grammaticalization that you mentioned at the end of your talk. I mean, in spoken languages, right, grammaticalization is also based on polysemy. But the examples of grammaticalization that you mentioned, they actually do exist in spoken languages. So my question, I was just thinking about this, the examples of colexification that you talked about, they indeed, they're very different from spoken language cases, but a grammaticalization process and examples, they are quite similar to the pathways that do exist in spoken languages. So how might we explain this? And the second kind of note or comment, when I was looking at different patterns of when you do have colexification in sign languages, and when we don't have this, it seems that in the cases where we don't have colexification is the cases of real metaphor, but the cases where we do have, like where sign languages can use the same actually sign, when the transfer is allowed, is the cases more of metonymy and not of metaphor. So it's a different semantic type of meaning extension. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Jenny, do you want to explain the difference between metaphor and the other example that Svetlana was speaking about?
Sure, and thanks, Svetlana. It's a very good question, but also quite abstract in terms of. I'm wondering if you could provide perhaps some more concrete examples from your spoken language linguistic research on the types of extensions and grammaticalizations in spoken language, just also for the audience can track this discussion a little bit better. And then happy to respond. We do have some thoughts about how grammaticalization and the process looks a little bit different in terms of spoken languages and sign languages. Oftentimes spoken language, actually sign language linguistics as well, they try to find similarities, right? They're like, yes, look, we've proven that spoken and sign languages are the same, but grammaticalization of pointing and grammaticalization of this sign for self, for example, that we just showed, like it's not going to, it can be compared to copula cycles. I like the comparison and the similarities, but at the same time, what we're trying to do is find what's different in spoken and sign languages. And this is one of those types of analysis to show exactly that there are some different types of processes happening in sign languages and spoken languages. And this is evident in our current contemporary lexicon. So that's more of what our goals are. So I guess I'll go back to asking you if you have any concrete examples to illustrate your question.
No, just I mean, I have examples from Israeli sign language, for example, where the pointing is used, as you mentioned, like the exaphoric pointing can be used as also for agreement and other types of more anaphoric type of pointing, more abstract type of pointing, but also as a complementizer, relative clause marker, right? And in spoken languages as well, like that, which is a deictic word, can be used for to point to something in the real world, but also as the distal pronoun, but also as the complementizer or relative clause marker. This is what I meant.
Okay. So what you're talking about is the grammaticalization of deictic terms that, and that process happens in spoken languages, the spoken language modality as well. And the gesture for pointing maybe they don't have the same kind of polysemy. So gesture is limited, I guess, to just those types of contexts. Obviously, there are different kinds of contexts, but pointing is limited to the sphere of gesture, right? Whereas you have relatives and the different functions that you had already mentioned, endophoric, demonstrative, and locative, and so on, shifting. So this is found in a lot of spoken language, deictic terms and pronouns. So that's I think that's one big difference that we're seeing in signed and spoken languages is where's the pointing, right? So where signs become like a multitude of properties and functions of pointing over time, and that's to do with how signing has evolved. So thank you for pointing that out, Svetlana.
Thank you. Next question is from the chat by Amelia Baker. I will read it out loud. Thank you so much for sharing this exciting work. I'm curious if you have thoughts about the pros and cons of framing these patterns as resulting from constraints or blocking as opposed to tendencies based on modality-specific resources. Do these two framings make different predictions, and does one or the other fit your findings better?
Yeah, so what we ended up using was this constraint framework, a constraint framing. But actually, that's a really interesting question to see if we found any differences focusing on the constraint and then also yeah, I'm not sure about those perspectives on the constraint. I think the constraint hypothesis really matches and links up with our findings a lot better. If you think about the sort of mental conception of these related categories, signers are, again, limited to expressing how they express them because of modality constraints as well, right? So they then perhaps need to borrow from another option to give them more capability. But if we can compare it with the comparative hypothesis, that might prove to be better. I don't know. Jenny, what do you think? I mean, that was actually a really interesting question.
The constraint hypothesis does fit our story and fits the methodology as well, to be honest. And our methodology is based on what's been used for typological studies of spoken languages, but we're not using free association production. We're not using that kind of elicitation, right? So we're not actually looking for new types of polysemes that are growing in these networks, right? So hopefully, what we need to do is free association types of tests, just absolutely free pre-production tests, and we might be able to see more flourishing than the constraints that we've presented today. I think that's something that maybe some other teams have already progressed on. I know that Nia Lazaris in her lab looking at colexification in DGS and BSL. I think they're also looking at another sign language, which escapes me right now. But Pamela Pernis's lab, for example, Ortega's lab, they're doing some free association work. I know Hope, your team is doing some of that as well. So. I mean, personally, I can think of a lot of different examples of polysemy in sign languages that we typically haven't shown yet in the current research. So I think one data finding that's interesting, perhaps, I mean, perhaps especially for you, Diane, is looking at one category called INSACT, INSACT. So it's instrumentation and action. So like if you look at an instrument like a hammer, okay, the sign for hammer, shows the action. And so you might have some phonological variations there, right? So you might have a hammer or whatever, a different type of iteration where you might have more repetitions of the action of a hammer hammering something. But the interesting thing is where you get the actor doing more colexification than you would expect in spoken languages because of morphological things that are going on in sign languages that aren't going on so it's how much repetition of movement, how easy is it to repeat things when you're moving rather than when you're talking, right? So these are some of the things that we're looking at, but I do appreciate the comment about how the concept of constraint in this case might need to be looked at again. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. So I don't see any raised hands in the chat. So yeah, Diane, please. Yep, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I hope, can you hear me? I'm going to just speak here to make things easier. Okay. I guess I wanted to know whether, as you move forward with this work, you might expand it in two ways. One is to be mindful of the writing system of the language in the surrounding countries. So the way that colexification might work is to also kind of cognitively interact with the way that, say, a language like English, which has more of a alphabetic writing system versus a Semitic language like Arabic or Hebrew, which has more of a three-letter root kind of writing system that might be relevant when it comes to colexification. I think this is one element that we linguists tend to omit because we tend to work on the speech or the signing, but sometimes I think for the language community as a whole, the writing system might be there as a device or as a resource. So I wondered about that. And then the other question has to do more with metaphor and pulling apart the different parameters for sign language. So when you talk about your recent example, Jenny, you were talking about hammering and hammering physically versus hammering, like hammering home your point. And if you're going to use that in spoken language, you might actually have all three parts of it, the whole word. But if you're talking about hammering home a point, the one thing that might be common between the hammer in the physical sense and the hammer in the metaphorical sense is that movement repetition. So you actually have to pull apart the different parameters, because you might hammer a point by just pounding on someone's non-dominant hand. And that's similar to the movement that is used in hammering physically. So those 2 points, a written system and then pulling apart the sign to the parameters.
We're just jotting down some notes.
Did you want to respond, Rachel?
I mean, that was a really interesting question, to both of your points about the written orthography. So I don't have a lot of knowledge about the Japanese writing system, so I couldn't answer any theoretical questions about that. But it's also really interesting to talk about that separation of morphology. Perhaps this repetitive motion matches the metaphor when sign language already matches a metaphor for the extension of that concept, like in actual hammering. So maybe in the future we could do a different kind of analysis looking at colexification where the metaphors match and when they don't. That could be quite interesting. Jenny, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you, Diane, for your point about looking at writing systems to see if there would be an influence. For example, in Japanese, relying on, I mean, in Chinese, obviously, many Asian Asian languages rely on characters like kanji. And so, for example, there's an iconicity that's already there, right? So the sign for I in Japanese Sign Language, if you translated into Japanese, into written Japanese, the character looks like an I. Okay, so I can't, don't even ask me to write it out for you, but if there's any Japanese signers here in the audience, please feel free to show that. But that often, that iconicity in the written system is quite interesting. I'm just wondering if there's an influence in the spoken language and how it shapes the spoken languages as well. But let me think on that. We would have to collaborate more with Asian researchers, I think, who would have a better, I guess, personal position to go in that direction. But thank you for the suggestion. One other potential direction we were thinking about going in is maybe trying to find rare spoken languages where there was a high percentage of ideophones or iconic representations in their lexicon. So, for example, some African languages have a very high percentage of ideophones that aren't represented in our data set. So we would probably be able to see some kind of metaphoric blocking in those languages that we do see in our data sets of the 3 sign languages we looked at. So they're thinking about that because we have a sort of confound of modality and iconic diversity factors. And so we want to see what happens there, right? To unconfound them, right? And then explore other spoken languages from there. And thanks again for your question, Diana.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to wrap up as we already are doing the presentation for more than an hour. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And of course, thank you for Rachel and Jenny. It was a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Our pleasure.